So at this point now in this series of videos attempting to reconstruct our synchronous session, you should have placed your original literary device-based paragraph and theory-based paragraph claims into a thread in our discussion below these videos, and you should have revised those sentences as needed. Maybe some of them are great, maybe some of them need work, but you should be showing us the original sentences and the revised ones. Okay, now what you want to do is walk with me through a conversation we had during the session where we talked about strategies for how to build body paragraphs from these claims using the logic of literary devices. We're suggesting that the literary device can be sort of the grammatical subject of a sentence or clause and help you unpack the language more fully and more carefully. So to make that work, you need to have a clear sense of definitions and some ideas on the link between the definition and how you can explain or interpret. Now remember what we're trying to do. We're trying to integrate brief quotes into sentences that identify devices, use the definition of the device to interpret the meaning of the language, and connects the device being used back to human agency. Those are the three moves we want to make each time we bring in evidence from a poem in a literary device-based paragraph. So the core four that you really want to know for this class are irony, imagery, symbol, and metaphor. And the word connotation informs all of those, right? Because if we recall, to connote something or a connotation is any kind of non-literal association we can make with a word, right? So a connotation can be a reference to an idea within the text or the culture. It can be a reference to a psychological or emotional connection. Any kind of non-literal connection evoked by a word is a connotation. And as you interpret irony, imagery, symbol, and metaphor, what you're really talking about are how these connotations, these non-literary meanings work. So if we look at irony, the key idea with irony is discrepancy. So if you mention irony in your paper, you want to explain what is the discrepancy, what was expected and what happens, and how does the author use that discrepancy to comment on human agency. When we go to imagery, similar kind of thing, right? An image is a direct appeal, a literal appeal to our senses that brings us to connotations or associated non-literal meanings. So when we look at an image, we want to explain its literal meaning. What kind of image is it? What's being evoked? But then we want to unpack the connotations, the symbolic meanings of the image. Again, like with irony, the definition of imagery opens up a structure for us to unpack, explain an image. Symbolism is the most straightforward, right? Symbolism is anything that has meanings beyond its literal meaning. So that can be an object, it can be a character, it can be dialogue, it can be a setting, it can be anything. In fact, irony, imagery, metaphor all operate off of symbolism and connotation, right? In many ways, symbolism and connotation are really the same thing. It's this idea of the non-literal. And this makes a really important point here that we talked about in the class. These terms do not exclude each other. There's a lot of crossover, and many times you'll pick a phrase from a poem that could be any one of these things. You could talk about irony, imagery, symbol, and metaphor all in one word or one 3-word phrase. But your goal to keep things organized and clear is to pick these devices out one at a time and unpack them. You don't want to be mixing too much at the same time. You want to think of them as separate in terms of your writing and discussion, but in reality, they're interwoven in the process of reading and interpreting. So again, with the symbol, the whole thing about if you identify something as a symbol, you can't just tell us it's a symbol, you need to tell us what it symbolizes, right? How the meaning, the symbolic meaning, the non-literal meaning, what that is and where it takes us. And then metaphor, the whole idea here, metaphor, simile, it's the same really. It's just a metaphor doesn't have that language explicitly stating that there's a comparison, such as like or as. But similes and metaphors really function the same way. There's a comparison, right? There's a vehicle being used, being compared to a tenor, and from the comparison of the vehicle to the tenor, we are learning something about the tenor. So what we want to ask is, and explain in our paragraphs to our reader is, if we say something's a metaphor, explain what is being compared to what, and explain what are, how does that comparison, how do the connotations of that comparison connect back to our tenor. And finally, people asked during the session about metonymy, and I tried to offer an explanation of that. In a way, a metonym is the substitution of something closely related to it for the original thing. So the classic one is we call what we refer to the president in like the evening news, you refer to as the White House. The White House is a building that's closely associated with the presidency. And when we say the White House, we're really referring to the presidency. We don't mean the building announced today, right? The White House announced today, we mean the president announced today. So that's an example of a metonym. And metonyms are about proximity. So metaphors are comparisons. Metonyms are proximity. So we can ask ourselves, how does the relationship between the metonym and what it represents comment on human agency? But metonym is sort of a more sophisticated option you can explore, but the core four you need are irony, imagery, symbol, and metaphor, all linked together by that magical word connotes. The verb connotes, the noun connotation. All right, so I'm going to pause here, but in our final video, I'm going to move on to looking at our literary device-based paragraphs and looking at a couple samples. And then I'm going to ask you to share a sample from your paper and comment on how you think you might develop it. Okay, so let's go to that last video, and then you'll do your last piece of contributing to this discussion. Thanks.